Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them, and sometimes those chances come wrapped in mystery. Phantom Briggs had given up on hope long ago, living as the town's forgotten mountain ghost until a blizzard led him to a cabin that would change everything. Deep in the high country, buried under fresh snow, stood a structure that shouldn't have existed on any map he knew. Inside, against all logic and reason, was a woman, alive but silent, barefoot in a faded dress, barely speaking above a whisper. She claimed she'd been waiting for him, though he'd never seen her face before in his 63 years of life. When he brought her down from the mountains, rumors spread like wildfire through the valley. Some said she was a spirit, others called her mad. But the real question wasn't who she was. It was what secret she'd been protecting in that frozen wilderness for all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather journal sat open on the rough-hewn table, its pages yellowed and weathered like autumn leaves. Phantom Briggs traced a finger along the latest entry, wind patterns shifting northeast, storm approaching within 48 hours. His handwriting had grown smaller over the years, cramped but precise, documenting 3 decades of mountain observations that most folks would consider the ravings of a hermit. He closed the journal and tucked it into his coat pocket, the familiar weight settling against his ribs like an old friend. The cabin around him spoke of solitude chosen rather than imposed. Every item had its place, every surface bore the careful attention of a man who had learned to find peace in the smallest details. Hand-carved shelves held mason jars of preserved vegetables, dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafters, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall with the efficiency of someone who understood that warmth meant survival. Outside, the wind had begun its restless dance through the pine boughs, carrying the scent of snow that wouldn't arrive for another day. Phantom had learned to read these signs the way other men read newspapers, finding in the mountain's moods a reliability that human company had never offered him. The people of Cedar Falls, 15 miles down the winding mountain road, had their own name for him. Mountain Ghost, they whispered when he appeared in town for supplies, moving through the general store with the quiet efficiency of someone who had forgotten how to make small talk. Children stared from behind their mothers' skirts, and shopkeepers counted his money twice, as if coins from a ghost might vanish before reaching the till. It hadn't always been this way. Once Phantom Briggs had been simply Simon Briggs, a man with a wife who laughed at his terrible jokes and a daughter who believed her father could fix anything broken in the world. He'd worked the lumber mill in those days, coming home each evening with sawdust in his hair and stories about the men he worked alongside. Margaret would have dinner waiting, and little Sarah would climb onto his lap to hear about the big trees that became houses and barns across 3 counties. The memories came less frequently now, blunted by time and deliberate forgetting, but they still caught him unaware in quiet moments. 23 years since the accident. 23 years since he'd learned that some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how clever your hands or how strong your will. The drunk driver who took them from him had walked away without a scratch, and Simon Briggs had walked into these mountains, leaving his old name and his old life buried with his family. He'd tried staying in town at first, accepting casseroles from well-meaning neighbors and enduring the careful kindness of people who meant well but couldn't understand that their pity felt like salt in an open wound. The empty house had echoed with ghosts, Margaret's humming from the kitchen, Sarah's laughter from the backyard swing he'd built with his own hands. Every corner held memories that threatened to drown him. The mountains had offered something different, silence that felt like healing rather than abandonment, and challenges that demanded his attention in the present moment rather than the unchangeable past. He'd started with weekend camping trips, then week-long expeditions, finally building the cabin that became his permanent refuge. The physical demands of mountain living, cutting firewood, maintaining his shelter, hunting and foraging for food, had given him a purpose that didn't require him to pretend the pain had healed. The townspeople had eventually stopped expecting him to return to normal life. Years passed, and Simon Briggs became Phantom, a figure glimpsed occasionally on the ridgelines, moving through the wilderness with an almost supernatural understanding of terrain and weather. Some claimed he could predict storms days in advance, that animals followed him without fear, that he knew every hidden trail and secret valley in 100 square miles. They weren't entirely wrong. Isolation had sharpened his senses and deepened his connection to the natural world in ways that still surprised him. He could smell rain in the air hours before clouds appeared, read the movements of deer and elk like a language, and navigate by instinct through country that would lose most experienced hikers. The mountains had taught him to listen, really listen, in ways he'd never learned in civilization. But loneliness was the price of such solitude, and it had carved hollows in his spirit that he'd learned to carry without complaint. He spoke to himself more often than he cared to admit, carrying on conversations with Margaret and Sarah that helped fill the endless quiet. His journal had become a repository not just for weather observations, but for thoughts he might once have shared over dinner, dreams that visited him in the long winter nights, and fears he'd never spoken aloud to another living soul. The approaching storm promised to be significant, the kind of weather event that could reshape the landscape and test even his considerable survival skills. His joints ached with the change in barometric pressure, and the animals had been restless for days, their behavior following patterns he'd learned to interpret as clearly as written warnings. Squirrels had been gathering stores with unusual urgency, and the birds had gone quiet in ways that spoke of serious weather approaching. He'd prepared as he always did, checking his supply of firewood, ensuring his water wouldn't freeze, and securing anything that might blow away in high winds. But something felt different about this storm, though he couldn't quite articulate the sensation that had been growing in the back of his mind for the past week. Call it intuition, or the accumulated wisdom of 3 decades in the mountains. But Phantom sensed that this weather would bring more than snow and wind. The town of Cedar Falls nestled in the valley below, like a child's toy village, its lights beginning to twinkle as evening approached. From his vantage point, Phantom could see the orderly grid of streets, the church steeple rising above modest homes, and the main street where people went about their daily business with the comfortable predictability of community life. He'd once been part of that pattern, his days measured by work schedules and social obligations, his identity defined by roles, husband, father, neighbor, that had given his life meaning and structure. Sometimes, usually on nights like this, when the loneliness pressed close, he wondered what his life might have looked like if he'd stayed, if he'd found a way to heal within the embrace of human company rather than in mountain solitude. But the wondering never lasted long. He'd made his choice and lived with its consequences, finding in the wilderness a kind of peace that might not have been possible any other way. As darkness settled over the high country, Phantom made his final preparations for what promised to be a memorable storm. He banked the fire to burn slowly through the night, checked his stores one more time, and settled into his reading chair with a cup of coffee and a worn paperback novel. Outside, the wind continued its restless conversation with the trees, and somewhere in that sound, he heard the approaching footsteps of change. Tomorrow, he would discover that some storms bring more than weather. Some storms bring second chances wrapped in mystery, delivered to the doorsteps of men who had stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. But tonight Phantom Briggs sat in his mountain cabin, reading by lamplight and listening to the wind, unaware that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be forever changed by a discovery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loss, hope, and the unexpected ways that life offers us new beginnings when we've given up looking for them. The storm arrived with the fury of an angry god, transforming the familiar mountain landscape into an alien world of driving snow and howling wind. Phantom woke before dawn to the sound of his cabin creaking under the assault, the windows rattling in their frames as gusts that must have topped 60 miles per hour battered the structure he'd built to withstand the worst the mountains could offer. By noon, 3 feet of snow had fallen, and the world beyond his windows had disappeared into a white void that swallowed trees and ridgelines alike. The storm had exceeded even his most dire predictions, and for the first time in years, Phantom felt genuine concern about his safety. The wind-driven snow was finding its way through gaps he'd never noticed, and ice was forming on the inside of his windows, despite the warmth from his wood stove. He spent the morning reinforcing weak spots and moving his most essential supplies away from the walls. But by afternoon it became clear that staying in the cabin might not be an option. A massive pine, its roots loosened by the saturated soil, crashed down just 50 yards from his front door, and the sound of splintering wood told him that others were likely to follow. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by old-growth forest, and what had always felt like protective shelter now seemed like a target in nature's shooting gallery. The decision to leave came when a section of his roof began to sag under the accumulated snow weight. Phantom had survived 3 decades in these mountains by trusting his instincts, and every sense he possessed was now screaming that he needed to find different shelter. He packed his emergency kit, food for 3 days, his sleeping bag, fire-starting materials, and his grandfather's compass, and prepared to venture into conditions that would challenge even his considerable skills. Moving through the storm felt like swimming through thick liquid, each step requiring tremendous effort as the wind tried to knock him off his feet, and the snow sought to blind him completely. He followed a game trail that led deeper into the high country, toward a series of rock formations he knew offered caves and overhangs that might provide better protection than his compromised cabin. But the storm had other plans. Within an hour of leaving his shelter, Phantom found himself completely disoriented, the familiar landmarks erased by the white fury that surrounded him. His compass spun wildly, affected by some magnetic disturbance he'd never encountered before, and the wind had shifted directions so many times that even his practiced sense of direction had abandoned him. It was then, struggling through snow that reached his thighs and fighting winds that threatened to lift him off his feet, that he glimpsed something impossible through the swirling white curtain, a structure dark and solid against the storm, standing where no building should exist according to his mental map of every square mile of this territory. As he fought his way closer, the shape resolved into a log cabin, smaller than his own, but built with the same practical attention to mountain weather. Snow had drifted against its walls, nearly reaching the windows, but the structure appeared sound and well-maintained despite looking as if it had been abandoned for years. No smoke rose from its chimney, no light showed in its windows, yet something about the building seemed to call to him through the storm. The door was unlocked, swinging open at his touch to reveal an interior that defied explanation. The cabin was warm, not just free from the killing cold outside, but actually warm, as if a fire had been burning recently. Candles flickered on a simple wooden table, their flames dancing without any apparent source of ignition. The single room was clean and orderly, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of careful craftsmanship and patient attention to detail. And sitting in a chair by the cold fireplace, as if she had been waiting for his arrival, was a woman. She appeared to be in her 40s, though something about her eyes suggested either great youth or impossible age. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple blue dress that looked as if it had been sewn decades ago, yet remained strangely pristine. Her feet were bare despite the cold, and when she looked up at his entrance, her expression showed no surprise at his sudden appearance. "You're earlier than I expected," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly in the warm air. "Though I suppose the storm changed your timing." Phantom stood in the doorway, snow melting from his coat and creating puddles on the wooden floor, struggling to process what he was seeing. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was hallucinating, that the stress of the storm and the disorientation had finally caused his 63-year-old brain to snap. But the warmth of the cabin was real, the woman's presence undeniable, and the candles continued to burn with steady flames that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "I don't understand," he managed, his voice rough from years of minimal use. "This cabin, it shouldn't be here. I know every building in a 50-mile radius." The woman smiled, though the expression carried a sadness that seemed to reach back through years of accumulated grief. "Time moves differently in the mountains," she said. "Things appear when they're needed, and people find what they're meant to find when the moment is right." She gestured to a chair across from her, and despite every instinct that told him to flee this impossible situation, Phantom found himself stepping fully inside and closing the door behind him. The storm's fury immediately became muted, as if the cabin existed in a pocket of calm within the chaos. "My name is Elena," the woman continued, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "And I've been waiting a very long time for you to arrive." "Waiting for me?" Phantom set down his pack and remained standing, ready to bolt if this strange dream turned into a nightmare. "Lady, I don't know who you think I am, but you're the one they call Phantom," Elena interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "The mountain ghost who lives alone and speaks to the wind. The man who lost everything and came here to forget." The accuracy of her words hit him like a physical blow. "How could you possibly know that?" "I know because I've been watching," Elena said simply. "I've seen you walking the ridgelines, talking to memories of people who can't answer back. I've watched you survive winters that would kill other men, and I've seen the way you carry your grief like a stone in your chest." She stood then, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural, and approached him with her hands extended. When she reached out to touch his arm, her fingers were warm, despite the impossible circumstances of their meeting. "The storm brought you here because it's time," she said. "Time for you to understand that some things that seem lost can still be found, and some people who appear to be alone have been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves." Phantom stared into her eyes, seeing depth that seemed to contain decades of secrets and sorrows that might rival his own. The logical part of his mind continued to insist that none of this could be real, but something deeper, some instinct that had kept him alive in the wilderness for 30 years, told him that Elena represented either his salvation or his destruction. "What are you?" he whispered. Elena's smile grew sadder, if such a thing were possible. "I'm someone who has been keeping watch for far longer than you might believe," she said. "And now that you're here, I can finally tell you about the children, and the secret I've been protecting, and why your arrival means that everything is about to change." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the impossible cabin, Phantom Briggs found himself face to face with a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about solitude, loss, and the unexpected ways that life offers second chances to those who have stopped believing in the possibility of redemption. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. Phantom had spent the night in Elena's impossible cabin, dozing fitfully in the chair she'd offered while she remained motionless by the fireplace, staring into flames that burned without consuming any visible fuel. When dawn broke through the windows, painting everything in soft gold light, the magic of the previous evening felt both more real and more impossible than before. Elena moved differently in daylight, her ethereal grace replaced by something more fragile and uncertain. She flinched at sudden sounds, the settling of snow on the roof, the distant crack of a tree branch, and her eyes darted constantly toward the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. When Phantom suggested they head down to Cedar Falls, she nodded with resignation rather than enthusiasm. "They won't understand," she said, pulling a worn shawl around her shoulders. "People rarely do when faced with things that don't fit their understanding of how the world works." The journey down the mountain proved challenging even for Phantom's experienced navigation skills. The storm had altered familiar landmarks, and more than once he found himself questioning routes he'd traveled hundreds of times. Elena moved through the deep snow with surprising ease, her bare feet somehow finding purchase on ice that should have sent her tumbling. But she spoke little during the hours-long descent. Cedar Falls greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that Phantom had expected, but Eleanor seemed unprepared to face. The general store fell silent when they entered, conversations stopping mid-sentence as every eye in the place fixed on the mysterious woman walking beside the mountain ghost. Elena pressed closer to Phantom's side, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Harold Brennan, the store's owner, a man who'd known Phantom since his Simon Briggs days. Ghost finally found himself some company. The comment drew nervous laughter from the other customers. But Phantom noticed how their amusement quickly turned to unease as they got a better look at Elena, her simple blue dress, clearly handmade but of excellent quality, belonged to no fashion from the past 50 years. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders in a style that suggested careful attention, but no modern styling products. Most unsettling of all were her eyes, ancient and watchful, as if she were cataloguing every detail of the modern world for some purpose they couldn't guess. Dr. Sarah Chen, the town's physician and one of the few people who still spoke to Phantom with genuine warmth, approached them with professional concern. Phantom, is everything all right? Is your friend injured?" "She needs a place to stay," Phantom said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after years of minimal conversation. "Somewhere warm and safe while we figure things out." Dr. Chen studied Elena with the careful attention of someone trained to read physical symptoms and emotional distress. "What's your name, dear?" "Elena," came the whispered response, so quiet that several people leaned forward to catch it. "Elena, I'm Dr. Chen. Can you tell me where you're from?" Elena's eyes darted to Phantom before returning to the doctor. "The mountains," she said. "I've been in the mountains for a long time." "How long?" The question hung in the air as Eleanor seemed to struggle with an answer that made sense. Finally she said, "Long enough to watch the seasons change many times. Long enough to see children grow old." Dr. Chen exchanged a meaningful look with Phantom. "Why don't we step into my office? I'd like to make sure you're both healthy." After being out in that storm, the medical examination revealed nothing alarming from a physical standpoint. Elena appeared to be in excellent health, despite her claims of living alone in the wilderness. But her responses to questions about her recent past remained vague and often contradictory. She claimed not to remember exactly when she'd arrived in the mountains, couldn't provide a last name, and seemed genuinely confused by references to current events or modern conveniences. While Dr. Chen completed her examination, Phantom found himself fielding questions from increasingly curious townspeople. Mary Elizabeth Hartwell, the self-appointed keeper of local history and gossip, had arrived with a stack of old photographs and documents from the Historical Society. "I've been thinking about your friend's appearance," Mary Elizabeth said, spreading photographs across Dr. Chen's waiting room table. "Something about her seemed familiar, so I went through our old mining camp records." She pointed to a sepia-toned photograph dated 1897, showing a group of families posed in front of log cabins that looked remarkably similar to the one Phantom had discovered. In the center of the group stood a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Elena. The same dark hair, the same watchful eyes, even the same style of simple dress. "This is from the Silverbrook Mining Company camp," Mary Elizabeth continued. "It was one of the operations that closed down during the mining wars in the 1890s. Most of the families disappeared when the violence started. Some say they fled to California. Others think they were killed." Phantom studied the photograph, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The resemblance was uncanny, but more unsettling was Elena's reaction when she emerged from the examination room and saw the image. Her face went white, and she reached out with trembling fingers to touch the glass. She began, then stopped, shaking her head as if trying to clear away cobwebs. I remember this day. The photographer made us stand so still, and little Timothy wouldn't stop fidgeting. Mary Elizabeth's eyes widened. Timothy Morrison. He was 6 years old when this picture was taken. That would make him dead, Eleanor said simply. They're all dead now. I watched over them as long as I could, but eventually everyone goes to sleep in the mountains. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Dr. Chen's wall clock. Phantom felt the familiar weight of grief settling in his chest, recognizing in Elena's words the same kind of loss that had driven him to the mountains 30 years ago. But there was something else in her voice, a resignation that spoke of watching over others through their final moments, of carrying responsibilities that had stretched across decades. Elena, Dr. Chen said gently, I'd like you to stay in town for a few days so we can make sure you're getting proper nutrition and rest. I can arrange a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Eleanor shook her head vehemently. I can't stay. The children might need me. Someone has to keep watch. What children? Phantom asked, though he suspected the answer would deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. Elena looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of years beyond counting. The ones who never made it down from the mountains, she said. The ones who got lost in the snow and cold and never found their way home. Someone has to remember where they sleep. The conversation that followed revealed fragments of a story that made little logical sense, but carried an emotional weight that none of them could dismiss. Elena spoke of maintaining vigils at hidden graves, of protecting sacred places from those who would disturb them, and of waiting for someone who could help her complete a task she'd carried alone for longer than anyone living could remember. As evening approached, it became clear that Elena would not be separated from Phantom, nor would she agree to stay in town without him. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, agreed to provide them with adjacent rooms, though she made it clear that such arrangements were highly irregular and would be the subject of considerable town gossip. That night, as Phantom lay in an unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of civilization beyond his window, he found himself thinking about the photograph and Eleanor's reaction to it. The resemblance could be coincidental, the product of shared ancestry, or simply the limitations of old photography. But something in Elena's eyes when she looked at that image suggested memories that reached back further than any normal human lifespan should allow. Tomorrow, he decided they would return to the mountains and begin looking for answers to questions he wasn't sure he was ready to ask. The antique silver locket revealed itself by accident the next morning when Elena bent to lace the boots Dr. Chen had provided her. The chain caught on a button of her dress, pulling the small pendant from where it had been hidden beneath the fabric. Phantom noticed it first, a delicate piece of jewelry that seemed far too valuable for someone who claimed to have been living rough in the mountains. May I see that? He asked gently, pointing to the locket. Elena's hand moved protectively to her throat, covering the pendant with her palm. For a moment, her eyes held the wild look of a cornered animal, but then she seemed to recognize something in Phantom's expression that reassured her. With trembling fingers, she lifted the chain over her head and placed the locket in his outstretched hand. The silver was tarnished with age, but still bore intricate engravings of mountain wildflowers around its edges. When Phantom pressed the small clasp, the locket opened to reveal a photograph of a young child, a boy with serious dark eyes and unruly hair, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. On the opposite side, engraved in flowing script, were the initials EM and TM, along with a date, June 15th, 1894. Timothy, Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. My Timothy. Phantom felt his chest tighten with a familiar ache. He recognized the tone in her voice, the way grief could compress an entire world of love and loss into a single name. Your son? Elena nodded, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. He would have been 6 when that photograph was taken at the mining camp. Such a bright boy, always asking questions about everything he saw. He wanted to know why the mountains changed colors with the seasons, why some rocks sparkled and others didn't, Why, the birds knew when to fly south. The pain in her voice was so raw, so immediate, that Phantom found himself struggling with his own memories. Sarah had been the same age when she died, full of endless curiosity about the world around her. The similarity hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he was back in his old kitchen, listening to his daughter's voice drift from the backyard as she played on the swing he'd built for her 6th birthday. What happened to him? Phantom asked, though he suspected the answer would be difficult to hear. Elena took the locket back, cradling it in both hands, as if it contained something more precious than memory. The winter of 1898 was harsh, even by mountain standards. Food became scarce, and some of the mining families started leaving for warmer places. But there were those who stayed, who believed the spring would bring new opportunities. She paused, staring into the distance, as if seeing events that had taken place more than a century ago. The Claiborne family controlled most of the profitable claims, and they didn't want competition from independent miners. They started spreading rumors about Indian attacks, about dangerous wildlife, anything to frighten the smaller operations into abandoning their stakes. Phantom had heard stories about the mining wars, the violent conflicts that had erupted throughout the Colorado Territory, as different groups fought for control of valuable claims. What he hadn't known was how deeply those conflicts had affected individual families. Children caught in the crossfire of adult greed and ambition. Timothy was playing near the creek when they came, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger even as her hands shook. I was hanging laundry, and I heard the horses before I saw them. By the time I realized what was happening, they had already taken him. Taken him where? Higher into the mountains, where they thought no one would look. They said it was a warning to the other families. Leave now or lose more than just your mining claims. Eleanor's eyes hardened with an anger that seemed to burn across the decades. I followed them, but by the time I found their camp, Timothy was already gone. They said he'd tried to escape and gotten lost in a snowstorm. The story explained much about Elena's protective instincts, her apparent familiarity with hidden places in the mountains, and her obsessive concern for lost children. But it raised other questions that Phantom wasn't sure he wanted to explore. If Timothy had died in 1898, Elena would have to be well over 100 years old to have been his mother. Yet the woman sitting beside him appeared to be in her 40s at most, with clear skin and steady movements that spoke of health and vitality. Elena, he said carefully, how long ago did this happen? She looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of years beyond counting. Time moves differently when you're waiting, she said. When you're keeping watch over places where terrible things happened, where justice was never served. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes like forever. Phantom understood the sensation she described, though his own experience with suspended time had lasted decades rather than centuries. Grief could indeed stretch moments into eternities, could make years pass like dreams, while single memories remained sharp enough to cut. Mary Elizabeth arrived at the boarding house just after noon, carrying an armload of documents and wearing the excited expression of someone who had made an important discovery. She spread the papers across the small table in Elena's room, her hands trembling with enthusiasm. I've been through every record we have from the 1890s, she announced. Birth certificates, death records, mining claim registrations, even some personal letters that were donated to the Historical Society. Look at this. She pointed to a faded birth certificate dated April 22nd, 1894. Timothy Michael Morrison, son of Elena Marie Morrison, born at Silverbrook Mining Camp. The document was signed by a midwife and witnessed by several camp residents, their signatures carefully preserved despite the passage of more than a century. And this, Mary Elizabeth continued, producing another document, a missing person report filed with the territorial authorities in December 1898. Timothy Morrison, age 4, disappeared from family camp. Mother Elena Morrison also missing, presumed dead, signed by Deputy Marshal William Claiborne. The name caught Phantom's attention immediately. Claiborne, the same family that controlled the mining syndicate. Elena finished, her voice flat with old hatred. William was the one who ordered Timothy's kidnapping. And when I wouldn't stop looking for my son, when I wouldn't accept their lies about what happened, they decided I was a problem that needed solving too. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture that defied rational explanation. But Phantom found himself believing Elena's story despite its impossible implications. The documentation was real, the pain in her voice authentic, and the locket provided physical proof of her connection to events that had taken place over a century ago. "They tried to kill you," he said. Not quite making it a question, Elena nodded slowly. "They brought me up to one of the high meadows during a blizzard, thinking the cold would do their work for them. But the mountains had other plans. Something happened that night. I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I survived. And I've been surviving ever since, keeping watch over the places where they hid their crimes, waiting for someone who could help me make things right." As the afternoon wore on, Elena shared more fragments of her impossible story. She spoke of finding Timothy's body in a hidden cave, of burying him with her own hands, while promising to protect other children from suffering the same fate. She described decades of solitary vigil, moving through the mountains like a guardian spirit, intervening when she could to prevent tragedies and maintaining memorials for those she couldn't save. The townspeople who gathered to hear her story reacted with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Some dismissed her claims as the delusions of a woman who had spent too long alone in the wilderness. Others found themselves drawn to the sincerity in her voice, the specific details that suggested either genuine memory or an elaborate fantasy based on careful historical research. But Phantom found himself believing not because of the evidence, but because of the recognition he saw in Elena's eyes. She carried grief the way he did, as a constant companion that shaped every thought and decision. The difference was that her mourning had been stretched across a time span that should have been impossible, sustained by some force that had kept her alive and aware long past any normal human lifespan. As evening approached, Elena made a request that surprised everyone present. "I want to go back to the mountains," she said. "There are things I need to show you, places where the truth is written in stone and earth. If you truly want to understand what happened to Timothy, to all the lost children, you'll have to see for yourself." Phantom nodded without hesitation, recognizing in her words an invitation to share the burden she'd carried alone for so long. Tomorrow they would return to the high country, and he would learn whether Elena's story was the product of a damaged mind or the testimony of someone who had witnessed horrors that history had chosen to forget. Elena's hands moved with surprising steadiness as she sketched on the piece of birch bark, her fingers guiding the charcoal stub with the confidence of someone who had traced these paths countless times. The map that emerged under her careful attention showed a topographical understanding of the high country that impressed even Phantom's experienced eye. Elevation changes marked with precise detail, water sources indicated with small symbols, and hidden trails that connected remote locations in ways that most maps never revealed. "This is where I found Timothy," she said, marking a spot with a small cross near what appeared to be a series of interconnected caves. "And here, another mark, this one deeper in the wilderness, is where they kept the other children when they thought no one was looking." Phantom studied the map with growing amazement. Elena had marked locations he recognized from his own decades of mountain exploration. But she had also indicated features he'd never discovered: hidden springs, natural shelters, and pathways that seemed to exist in the spaces between the official trails. Most intriguing were the symbols she'd drawn at various points, small circles that she explained were burial sites, squares that marked abandoned campsites, and triangles that designated what she called safe houses. "How many children?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Elena's expression grew distant as she continued adding details to the map. 43 that I know of, though there may have been more. The Claiborne syndicate used kidnapping as a weapon to drive out competing miners. Take a family's children, and they'll abandon even the richest claims to search for them. Most never found their little ones alive. The scope of the crime, described by Elena's map, staggered Phantom. He'd known about the violence of the mining wars in general terms, but the systematic targeting of children represented a level of calculated cruelty that went beyond simple business competition. It was genocide disguised as economic warfare, designed to eliminate entire families rather than just their claims. Why hasn't anyone found evidence of this before? Phantom asked. 43 children don't just disappear without leaving traces. Elena looked up from her map, with eyes that held depths of sorrow he was still learning to read. Because the Claibornes controlled the law as well as the mining operations. Deputy Marshal William Claiborne wrote the official reports, decided which disappearances to investigate and which to ignore. Anyone who asked too many questions found themselves facing charges for disturbing the peace or interfering with legitimate business operations. She pointed to a series of marks. High on the eastern slope of Mount Sterling, an area Phantom knew to be nearly inaccessible except to experienced climbers. This is where they built their main camp, the place where they brought children who couldn't be released because they'd seen too much. It's hidden in a natural amphitheater that can't be seen from any of the normal approaches. The first location Elena led him to was a meadow he'd passed through hundreds of times without recognizing its significance. Hidden beneath a canopy of old-growth pines, the site appeared to be nothing more than a natural clearing where wildflowers bloomed in seasonal profusion. But Elena's trained eye picked out details that spoke of long-ago human habitation, stone foundations nearly buried under decades of leaf litter, the remains of a well that had been carefully concealed, and subtle changes in vegetation that marked where buildings had once stood. This was the Morrison family camp, Elena said, kneeling beside what had once been the foundation of a cabin. Timothy and I lived here for 2 years, while his father worked the silver claim up the ridge. It was a good life, hard but honest. We had neighbors who shared what they had when times were difficult, and children who played together regardless of which family they belonged to. Phantom watched her move through the abandoned campsite with the careful reverence of someone visiting a grave. She touched certain stones as if greeting old friends, paused at spots where specific memories seemed to rise from the earth, and spoke in whispers about people who had been dead for over a century, as if they might still be listening. The emotional weight of her grief was palpable, but there was something else in Elena's demeanor that troubled him. She moved through this place with an intimacy that suggested recent familiarity rather than distant memory. The way she knew exactly where to look for hidden features, the casual manner in which she navigated obstacles that should have been overgrown by decades of forest growth, it all pointed to someone who had been tending this site regularly rather than simply remembering it. You've been coming back here, he said, not quite making it a question. Elena nodded without looking up from the stone she was examining. Every year on Timothy's birthday, and again on the anniversary of the day they took him, they bring wildflowers and tell him about the changing seasons, about the animals I've watched grow old, about the few children I've been able to help over the years. She led him to a depression in the earth that he would have mistaken for a natural hollow, but which Elena revealed to be the remains of a root cellar. Using her hands to clear away accumulated debris, she exposed a wooden trapdoor that creaked open to reveal a space that had been carefully maintained despite its apparent abandonment. Inside the underground chamber, Phantom found evidence that transformed Elena's story from possible delusion to documented reality. Carefully preserved in oiled cloth were photographs, letters, official documents, and personal belongings that told the story of the Morrison family and their neighbors. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, mining claim registrations, and correspondence with relatives. Back east painted a picture of ordinary people, trying to build extraordinary lives in an unforgiving landscape, and most compelling were the children's belongings, toys carved from wood, small clothes sewn with careful attention to growing bodies. and books with inscriptions from parents who believed education was important, even in the wilderness. Elena handled each item with reverence, sharing stories about their owners with a specificity that suggested either perfect memory or careful documentation. "This was Timothy's favorite," she said, holding up a small wooden horse with a broken leg that had been carefully repaired. "His father carved it for his 4th birthday, and he carried it everywhere. Even when the other children teased him for playing with baby toys, he wouldn't give it up." Phantom felt his throat tighten as he watched Elena cradle the toy horse. The gesture reminded him of his own ritual visits to Sarah's grave, the way he still brought her favorite flowers on her birthday and spoke to her headstone as if she might respond. Grief created its own language, its own ceremonies, and he recognized in Elena's actions the same desperate need to maintain connection with love that death had interrupted. But the root cellar contained more than sentimental artifacts. Elena showed him a metal box that held what appeared to be evidence of the crimes she'd described, letters between members of the Claiborne Syndicate discussing problem families, lists of children with notations beside their names, and detailed maps showing the locations of hidden camps and burial sites. "I gathered these over the years," Elena explained, taking them from abandoned campsites and finding them in places where the guilty thought they'd hidden their secrets forever. "Some I took from the bodies of men who died with their crimes unconfessed. Others I found in caches they buried, thinking they'd return someday to destroy the evidence." The documents painted a picture of systematic atrocity that went far beyond the casual violence typically associated with mining conflicts. The Claiborne Syndicate had operated with the efficiency of a military organization, using terror tactics that specifically targeted the most vulnerable members of competing families. Children weren't just collateral damage in their war for mineral rights, they were weapons. Their suffering designed to break the will of adults who might otherwise fight for their claims. "Why keep all this hidden?" Phantom asked. "Why not bring it to the authorities years ago?" Elena's laugh held no humor. "What authorities? The Claiborne family built this town with their stolen wealth. They own the mayor's office, the sheriff's department, and half the businesses on Main Street. Justice for murdered children doesn't exist when the murderers control the courts." As they climbed higher into the mountains, following Elena's hand-drawn map toward the sites where she claimed the worst atrocities had taken place, Phantom found himself struggling with questions that had no easy answers. Eleanor's knowledge of the terrain was undeniable, her evidence compelling, and her grief genuine. But the implications of her story required him to accept possibilities that challenged everything he thought he understood about life, death, and the nature of justice. The sun was setting by the time they reached the first of the locations Elena had marked as a burial site. Hidden in a grove of aspen trees whose white bark gleamed like bones in the fading light, she showed him a series of small stone cairns that marked the graves of children who had died far from home. Each pile of rocks bore scratched initials and dates, creating a memorial that had been maintained by Elena's solitary vigil for over a century. "I couldn't save them," she said, kneeling beside one of the cairns, "but I could make sure they weren't forgotten, that someone remembered their names and mourned their passing, that someone kept watch over the places where they sleep until justice could finally find them." Standing in that grove of memorial stones, surrounded by the vast silence of the mountains and the weight of Elena's impossible story, Phantom began to understand that he had been chosen for something larger than his own healing. Elena had been waiting not just for someone who could help her complete her vigil, but for someone who understood the price of carrying grief across years that stretched beyond normal human endurance. Tomorrow, she would show him the places where the worst crimes had been committed, and he would have to decide whether he was prepared to help her seek the justice that had been denied for more than a century. The carved wooden cross stood sentinel in a hidden glen where morning mist clung to ancient pine boughs like the whispered prayers of the dead. Elena approached it with the careful reverence of someone entering sacred ground. her footsteps silent on the carpet of fallen needles that had accumulated around its base over decades of seasons. Phantom followed at a respectful distance, recognizing the solemn ritual of her approach. The cross itself was larger than he'd expected, hewn from mountain cedar with the careful attention to detail that spoke of someone who understood that this memorial might be the only monument these children would ever receive. Deep grooves carved into the wood listed names in chronological order, each accompanied by an age that broke his heart. Timothy Morrison, 4. Sarah Beth Collins, 6. Michael James Brennan, 8. The list continued down both arms of the cross with terrible precision. 43 names, Elena said, running her fingers along the carved letters with the gentle touch of a mother checking on sleeping children. I carved this cross myself, adding each name as I found their resting places. It took me 7 years to locate all of them, but as Phantom examined the memorial more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One name had been deliberately scratched out, the wood gouged and scraped until the letters were barely legible beneath the damage. When he pointed this out to Elena, her expression darkened with an anger that seemed to reach across the decades. Marcus Claiborne, she said, her voice flat with old hatred. William's youngest son. He was 8 years old when his father's men took Timothy, and he was there when they brought the children to the hidden camps. But he wasn't a victim. He was learning the family business. The story Elena told as they sat beside the memorial cross painted a picture of inherited evil that had been passed down through generations like a family trade. Marcus Claiborne had been raised to see violence as a tool of business, murder as the acceptable method of claim jumping, and the suffering of children as merely the cost of maintaining power. He grew up to be worse than his father, Elena continued, her eyes fixed on the scratched-out name. William at least pretended the killings were necessary for business. Marcus enjoyed them. He developed new methods of torture, found ways to make children suffer that his father had never imagined. Phantom felt sick as Elena described the evolution of the Claiborne family's crimes, how each generation had found new depths of cruelty to explore. But what troubled him most was the way Eleanor spoke about events that should have taken place decades after her own death, as if she had witnessed the entire bloody dynasty from its beginning to what she claimed was its eventual end. Marcus died in 1953, she said, answering the question he hadn't yet asked. Fell from a cliff while hunting, though those who knew about his other activities suspected justice had finally found him. But by then the damage was done. The Claiborne wealth was established, their crimes buried under layers of respectability and municipal power. The deeper caves Elena led him to revealed evidence that supported her most disturbing claims. Hidden chambers, accessible only through passages that required crawling through spaces barely wide enough for an adult body, contained artifacts that told stories of systematic torture and murder spanning decades. Chains bolted to stone walls, tools designed for inflicting pain, and personal belongings taken from victims painted a picture of industrialized cruelty that went far beyond the casual. Violence of frontier disputes, but most horrifying were the journals, detailed records kept by successive generations of Claibornes documenting their crimes with the meticulous attention of bookkeepers, recording business transactions. Names, dates, methods of torture, and final disposal locations were all carefully noted in handwriting that grew more confident and elaborate as the years progressed. They were proud of their work, Elena said, handling one of the journals with the careful attention necessary to preserve evidence that might someday see courtroom light. Each generation tried to outdo the previous one, to find new ways to break spirits before breaking bodies. Phantom read entries that made him question his faith in human nature. Children described not as victims, but as inventory, their suffering documented with clinical detachment that suggested complete psychological disconnection from the reality of their actions. Maps showed disposal sites scattered across hundreds of square miles of wilderness, locations chosen specifically because they would never be found by searchers. How many people knew about this? He asked, struggling to understand how such systematic evil could exist without exposure. Elena's expression grew grim. More than you might think. Fewer than it should have taken to stop it. The Claibornes were careful to involve influential people in their crimes. Judges, sheriffs, business leaders who benefited from the wealth generated by stolen claims. Once you're complicit in one murder, it becomes easier to ignore the next dozen. She showed him correspondence that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Elected officials who received regular payments in exchange for overlooking disappearances. Businessmen who laundered money derived from stolen mining claims. And religious leaders who provided moral cover for families whose wealth came from blood. The corruption had infected every level of territorial society, creating a web of complicity that made justice impossible through conventional means. That's why I've been waiting, Elena said, closing the journal they'd been examining. Waiting for someone who wasn't part of their system, someone who could see the truth without being blinded by money or position or fear. Someone who understood that some crimes are so terrible they demand justice regardless of how much time has passed. As they explored deeper into the cave system, Elena revealed the full scope of her century-long investigation. She had documented not just the original crimes, but their continuing effects, how Claiborne wealth had shaped the development of Cedar Falls, how their influence had prevented any serious investigation into the missing families, and how their descendants continued to benefit from wealth built on the bones of murdered children. The current generation doesn't know the full truth, Elena explained. But they know enough to maintain the cover-up. Mayor James Claiborne is Marcus's grandson, and Sheriff Robert Claiborne is his great-nephew. They've spent their entire lives protecting the family, reputation, without understanding exactly what they're protecting. But Elena's investigation had uncovered something that could change everything. Evidence that the Claiborne crimes hadn't ended with Marcus's death in 1953. She led Phantom to a section of the cave, where more recent artifacts suggested continuing activities well into the modern era, camping equipment from the 1970s and 1980s, personal belongings that couldn't have been in the caves for more than a few decades, and most disturbing of all, photographs that showed the cave system had been used for purposes she was reluctant to describe in detail. Some traditions die hard, she said, her voice barely audible in the enclosed space. And some families pass down more than just money and property. They pass down appetites that normal society can't satisfy. The implications of Elena's discovery hit Phantom like a physical blow. If the Claiborne family had continued their activities into the modern era, it meant that the children currently living in Cedar Falls might be at risk from threats their parents couldn't imagine. It meant that the evil Elena had been documenting for over a century was not a historical curiosity, but a continuing danger that required immediate action. "We have to take this to the authorities," he said. Though even as he spoke the words, he realized their futility. Elena's sad smile confirmed his worst fears. "Which authorities?" "The sheriff who shares the Claiborne name, the mayor whose election campaigns are funded by Claiborne businesses, the state attorney general whose political career depends on Claiborne contributions." As they made their way back toward the cave entrance, Elena shared the final piece of her investigation, evidence that the current generation of Claibornes was planning something that would eclipse even their ancestors' crimes. Hidden documents suggested a development project that would destroy the evidence of historical atrocities while providing cover for new ones. A plan that would finally erase the last traces of Elena's century-long vigil. "They're going to build a resort," she said, showing him architectural plans and environmental impact studies that had been carelessly discarded in one of the cave chambers. "A luxury mountain retreat that will bring hundreds of families to the area. Children isolated from their normal support systems and surrounded by wilderness where disappearances can be explained as hiking accidents." The scope of the planned atrocity staggered Phantom. Not content with covering up historical crimes, the current generation of Claibornes was preparing to commit new ones on a scale that would dwarf even their ancestors' systematic evil. And they would do it with the full support of law enforcement and municipal government, protected by the same web of corruption that had shielded their family for over a century. Standing at the mouth of the cave, as evening light painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Phantom realized that Elena had brought him to a moment of choice that would define the rest of his life. He could walk away, return to his mountain cabin and the solitary existence that had insulated him from the world's horrors for 30 years. Or he could accept the role Elena had been preparing for him, that of an instrument of justice for crimes that conventional law enforcement would never address. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, Elena's smile carried hope for the first time since he'd met her. "I need someone who understands that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Someone who knows that protecting children is more important than protecting yourself. Someone who can help me finish what I started over a century ago. Tomorrow, she would show him the evidence that could bring down the Claiborne dynasty, and he would have to decide whether he was prepared to wage war against an enemy that had spent generations perfecting the art of escaping justice. The hidden compartment in Elena's cabin revealed itself only when Phantom accidentally bumped against what he'd assumed was a solid wall. The wood panel shifted under the pressure of his shoulder, sliding aside to expose a space that had been carefully concealed behind the fireplace's stone chimney. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and preserved with the same meticulous care Elena had shown for everything else, were documents that would rewrite everything he thought he understood about her story. The deed papers were written in the formal legal language of the 1890s, but their meaning was unmistakable. Elena Marie Morrison was listed as the sole heir to mining claims that encompassed nearly 3,000 acres of the richest mineral deposits in the territory, including the land on which Cedar Falls itself had been built. The inheritance came from her father, Thomas Morrison, whose signature appeared on claim. Registrations dating back to 1885, 7 years before the major mining boom that had drawn the Claiborne syndicate to the area. "Your family were the original claimants," Phantom said, studying the carefully preserved documents with growing amazement. "They didn't just kill your son, they stole your entire inheritance." Eleanor nodded, her expression mixing vindication with sorrow that had been compressed across decades of injustice. "My father was one of the first prospectors to recognize the potential of this valley. He filed legal claims on the major silver veins 3 years before William Claiborne even arrived in the territory. But legitimate ownership meant nothing when it stood in the way of men who preferred theft to honest work. The legal documents painted a picture of systematic fraud that had been carefully orchestrated over several years. The Claibornes hadn't simply murdered competing miners. They had created an elaborate scheme to transfer legal ownership of valuable claims to themselves through forged documents, bribed officials, and the elimination of anyone who might challenge their false titles. They couldn't just take the land by force, Elena explained, handling the deed papers with reverence due to sacred artifacts. Territorial law required proper documentation, witnesses, and official registration. So they created a paper trail that made their theft appear legal, then eliminated anyone who knew the truth about the original ownership. But the documents revealed something even more shocking than historical theft. The mineral rights Elena had inherited from her father included subsurface claims that extended far beyond the original mining areas, encompassing deposits of rare earth metals that hadn't been economically viable in the 1890s, but were worth millions in the modern economy. The planned resort development wasn't just about covering up historical crimes, it was about extracting resources that legally belonged to Elena. "They know," she said simply. "The current generation has always known that their wealth was built on stolen property. But recent geological surveys have revealed just how valuable my father's original claims really are. They're not just trying to hide evidence of murder, they're preparing to steal again. Phantom studied a geological report that had been filed with the county planning office, noting how carefully the proposed resort boundaries had been drawn to encompass exactly the areas covered by Elena's original inheritance. The Claibornes weren't planning a simple development project. They were executing a land grab that would finally give them legal ownership of property they'd been illegally occupying for over a century. "But you're still alive," he said, though even as he spoke the words, he struggled to understand their implications. "If you can prove your identity, these deeds would make you the legitimate owner of half the valley." Elena's laugh held no humor. "Prove my identity to whom?" "The courts that have been controlled by Claiborne influence for 4 generations. The sheriff's department that's been protecting their interests since territorial days. The state land office, where their people have been destroying inconvenient records for over a century." She showed him correspondence that revealed the scope of the modern conspiracy. Letters between current Claiborne family members discussing the Morrison problem and strategies for permanently eliminating any challenges to their property rights. The language was more sophisticated than their ancestors' crude brutality, but the intent remained unchanged. Elena represented a threat to wealth built on stolen land and covered up with murdered witnesses. "They've been watching me," Elena continued, producing photographs that made Phantom's blood run cold. Images of Elena tending the memorial sites, maintaining the hidden evidence caches, and even sleeping in her impossible cabin painted a picture of surveillance that had been going on for decades. The Claibornes knew exactly where she was and what she was doing. They'd simply been waiting for the right moment to eliminate the last witness to their family's crimes. "Why now?" Phantom asked, though he suspected the answer would involve the resort development and the modern mineral rights. Elena pointed to a letter dated just 3 months earlier, written on the official letterhead of the Colorado State Land Management Office. The document informed the Claiborne Mining Corporation that their application for expanded mineral extraction rights had been approved, pending final resolution of any competing claims on the designated properties. "Someone in the state government did their job properly," Elena said with grim satisfaction. They found references to the original Morrison claims in the Sashu territorial archives and flagged them as potential conflicts that needed to be resolved before new extraction permits could be issued. The bureaucratic discovery had created a crisis for the Claiborne family that went far beyond simple embarrassment. If Elena's legitimate ownership was recognized, it would not only cost them millions in mineral rights, but would also open them to criminal prosecution for a century of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Every business deal, every political contribution, every civic improvement project funded with stolen wealth could be challenged in court. "They can't let you live," Phantom said, understanding finally why Elena had been waiting for someone who could help her complete her mission. "Not just because of what you know about the historical murders, but because of what you represent to their current operations." Elena nodded, her ancient eyes reflecting a weariness that came from carrying impossible burdens across impossible spans of time. "They've been planning my death for months, waiting for the resort development to provide cover for one final disappearance. A hiking accident in a remote area, a body that's never found, case closed." But Elena had been preparing for this confrontation far longer than her enemies realized. The hidden compartment contained more than just legal documents. It held evidence of modern crimes that would destroy the Claiborne family's carefully maintained respectability. Photographs of contemporary activities in the hidden caves, financial records showing how murder-derived wealth had been laundered through legitimate businesses, and correspondence proving that current family members were actively conspiring to commit fraud and eliminate witnesses. "I've been documenting everything," Elena said, showing him digital storage devices that seemed incongruous in the rustic cabin. Every conversation I could overhear, every document I could photograph, every piece of evidence that proves the Claiborne family's current activities are just as criminal as their ancestors' murders. The scope of Elena's modern investigation revealed capabilities that didn't match her apparent isolation from civilization. Somehow, despite living alone in the mountains for decades, she had managed to infiltrate secure locations, photograph sensitive documents, and record conversations that would require sophisticated surveillance equipment. How? Phantom asked, gesturing to the collection of evidence that would have challenged the resources of a professional intelligence operation. Elena's smile carried secrets that reached back through decades of careful preparation. You forget that I've had over a century to perfect my techniques. I've learned to move through their world like a ghost, to hear conversations they thought were private, to access records they believed were secure. When you have unlimited time and unlimited motivation, you can accomplish things that seem impossible. She showed him architectural plans for the current Claiborne mansion that revealed hidden rooms and passages unknown to law enforcement, detailed schedules of family members that demonstrated months of careful observation, and financial records that proved modern Claiborne wealth was still derived from activities that would destroy them if exposed to public scrutiny. They think they're hunting me, Elena said, organizing the evidence with the careful attention of someone preparing for war. But I've been hunting them for longer than they can imagine. I know their weaknesses, their secrets, their fears. I know exactly how to destroy them. The revelation transformed Elena from mysterious victim to dangerous adversary, someone who had spent over a century preparing for a confrontation that would finally bring justice to crimes that conventional law enforcement had never been able to address. But it also raised questions about the nature of her survival that Phantom wasn't sure he was ready to explore. Elena, he said carefully, what exactly are you? Her expression grew thoughtful, as if she were considering how much truth he could handle. I'm someone who refused to die while injustice remained unfinished. Someone who discovered that the mountains have their own laws about life and death, and sometimes those laws allow exceptions for purposes that transcend normal human understanding. As evening approached, Elena revealed the final element of her century-long plan. The resort development that the Claibornes intended to use as cover for eliminating her would instead become the stage for their own destruction. She had evidence that would expose not just their historical crimes, but their contemporary corruption. Documentation that would bring down their political allies and business partners, and proof that would make their stolen wealth subject to forfeiture. Tomorrow, she said, sealing the documents back in their protective wrapping. They're planning to make their move. Mayor Claiborne has called a special town meeting to announce the resort development, and Sheriff Claiborne will be providing security. They think it's the perfect opportunity to eliminate the last threat to their empire. Phantom realized that Elena had orchestrated events to bring all her enemies together in one place, at one time where the evidence she'd gathered could be presented to the largest possible audience. But he also understood that she was planning something that would put both their lives at risk. What do you need me to do? He asked, though he suspected the answer would require him to confront dangers he'd spent 30 years avoiding. Elena's smile was fierce with anticipation of justice finally served. I need you to help me prove that some crimes are so terrible they create their own laws of retribution, and some debts can only be paid in full when the truth finally comes to light. Phantom's father's military compass sat heavy in his weathered hands. Its brass case worn smooth by decades of use in theaters of war most people could never imagine. He'd carried it through 3 tours in Vietnam, where Lieutenant Simon Briggs had earned commendations that he'd never spoken about to his wife or daughter. The weight of the instrument brought back memories he'd buried beneath 30 years of mountain solitude, tactical planning sessions, reconnaissance missions, and the cold calculations required to outmaneuver enemies who had every advantage except experience. You were military, Elena said, watching him study the compass with the practiced attention of someone reading a critical instrument. It wasn't a question. Somehow she had recognized in his movements the economy of motion that came from years of training for situations where mistakes meant death. "Long time ago," Phantom replied. Though the skills had never truly left him, even in his mountain isolation, he'd maintained the habits of situational awareness, route planning, and resource management that had kept him alive in jungles where a moment's inattention could be fatal. Different life, different man. Elena's expression suggested she understood that some transformations were never complete, that the essence of what made a person dangerous could lie dormant for decades before circumstances awakened it again. The town meeting is set for 7 tonight at the community center. Mayor Claiborne expects a full turnout. He's been promising announcements about economic development that will bring prosperity to everyone. Phantom nodded, already beginning to analyze the tactical situation with instincts he hadn't used since the war. The community center was a single-story building with multiple exits, large windows that could serve as observation points or escape routes, and a stage area that would give Elena visibility to the entire assembled crowd. But it was also a space that the Claibornes would control, with Sheriff Claiborne's deputies positioned to handle any disruptions that might interfere with their presentation. "They'll be expecting you to try something," he warned. "A century of preparation won't mean much if they're ready for your move." Elena's smile carried confidence that had been building through decades of patient planning. "They're expecting the same woman who ran from them in 1898, someone who could be frightened into silence or eliminated through crude violence. They're not prepared for someone who has spent over a century learning their weaknesses and planning their destruction." She showed him a detailed layout of the community center that revealed knowledge no casual observer could possess: structural details, security camera positions, and even the location of electrical and communication systems that could be disrupted if necessary. Elena had been preparing for this confrontation with the thoroughness of a military operation, and Phantom recognized in her planning the same attention to detail that had characterized his own successful missions. "The deputies will be armed," he observed, studying the positioning she'd marked on the building plans. "And Claiborne will have backup ready, and they won't hesitate to use force if they feel threatened." Elena nodded, acknowledging the danger while demonstrating that she'd already accounted for it in her planning. "That's where your skills become crucial. I need someone who can move through hostile territory, who can protect civilians while ensuring the evidence reaches the people who need to see it. I need someone who understands that sometimes the only way to prevent greater violence is to be prepared for inevitable confrontation." The preparations that followed reminded Phantom of mission briefings from a lifetime ago, when young soldiers learned to balance audacity with caution in pursuit of objectives that conventional approaches couldn't achieve. Elena had assembled not just evidence, but a comprehensive plan for presenting it in ways that would maximize impact while minimizing the opportunity for the Claibornes to suppress or discredit it. "The key is simultaneity," she explained, showing him communication equipment that seemed sophisticated for someone who claimed to live in mountain isolation. "The evidence has to reach multiple audiences at the same time: the townspeople at the meeting, state authorities who can't be bought, and media outlets that will ensure the story can't be buried." Phantom studied the coordination required for Elena's plan, recognizing the complexity of an operation that demanded precise timing and flawless execution. She had identified allies in unexpected places, townspeople who had been harboring their own suspicions about Claiborne activities, state investigators who had been frustrated by local obstruction of their inquiries, and journalists who specialized in exposing corruption in small communities. Mary Elizabeth Hartwell has been documenting inconsistencies in official records for years, Eleanor continued, revealing the extent of her intelligence network. Dr. Chen has been questioning unexplained injuries and deaths that the sheriff's department refused to investigate properly. Even Harold Brennan has been keeping track of Claiborne. Business dealings that seemed too profitable for legitimate operations. The revelation that Elena had been cultivating allies throughout the community suggested planning that went far beyond a simple desire for revenge. She had been building a coalition of people who shared her commitment to justice. Individuals who had been waiting for someone with the evidence and courage necessary to challenge the Claiborne stranglehold on local institutions. "They trust you," Phantom observed, understanding that Elena had somehow earned the confidence of people who had never heard her full story. "They trust what I represent," Elena corrected. "The possibility that truth can triumph over power, that ordinary people can stand up to corruption when they have the right evidence and the right moment. They've been waiting for someone to give them permission to act on what they've always suspected." As afternoon wore on, Phantom found himself slipping back into tactical mindset with an ease that troubled him. The careful analysis of terrain, the calculation of risks and benefits, the mental preparation for violence that might be necessary to protect innocent lives, all of it came back as if 30 years of peaceful mountain living had been nothing more than an extended leave from his true profession. Elena watched his transformation with understanding that suggested she recognized the necessity of awakening capabilities he'd hoped never to use again. "I'm sorry to ask this of you," she said quietly. "I know you came to the mountains to escape from violence, not to find more of it." Phantom thought about Sarah and Margaret, about the drunk driver who had destroyed his family and walked away without consequences, about the years he'd spent believing that justice was a luxury the world couldn't afford. "Some fights choose us," he said finally. "Some wrongs are so deep that walking away just makes us complicit in their continuation." The final preparations involved positioning backup evidence in locations where it could be retrieved if the primary plan failed, establishing communication protocols with Elena's network of allies, and creating contingency options for scenarios that might require immediate evacuation or armed resistance. Phantom found himself drawing on skills he'd acquired in situations where failure meant death for entire units, adapting counterinsurgency tactics to the challenge of exposing civilian corruption. "If something happens to me," Elena said, handing him copies of the most critical documents, "promise me you'll find a way to finish this. Promise me that Timothy and all the other children won't be forgotten again." Phantom accepted the responsibility with the gravity due to a sacred trust. He understood that Elena was asking him to carry forward a mission that had sustained her through impossible years, to become the guardian of justice for crimes that would otherwise remain forever hidden. As evening approached and the community center began, filling with townspeople who expected routine announcements about economic development, Phantom positioned himself according to Elena's carefully planned strategy. He carried with him not just his father's compass, but the accumulated weight of 3 decades in the mountains, 20 years of marriage and fatherhood, and military training that had prepared him for challenges he'd hoped never to face again. Elena made her own final preparations with the calm precision of someone who had been planning this moment through decades of patient waiting. She carried with her evidence that would destroy a century of carefully constructed lies, documents that would bring justice to 43 murdered children, and proof that would finally give her the peace that had been denied since the winter of 1898. "It's time," she said, checking the evening light and judging the moment when the community center would be at its fullest capacity. "Time to find out whether truth is stronger than the power that's been built on lies." Phantom nodded, feeling the familiar calm that had always preceded his most dangerous missions. Tonight he would discover whether the skills that had made him an effective soldier could be adapted to the challenge of protecting someone whose mission transcended conventional understanding of justice and retribution. The compass in his pocket pointed steadily north, but tonight True direction would be measured by moral considerations that no instrument could calculate. The ancient mining bell sat like a tarnished artifact on the stage of the community center, its bronze surface dulled by decades of weather, but still possessing the weight and presence that had once summoned miners to safety during cave-ins and emergencies. Elena had insisted on bringing it from the original Morrison mine site, claiming it would serve as both evidence and symbol of the justice they sought to deliver. Mayor James Claiborne stood at the podium with the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted his right to control the narrative. His polished appearance and practiced smile spoke of a man who had spent his entire political career deflecting questions and managing public perception, skills that had served his family well in maintaining their stranglehold on local power. Behind him, Sheriff Robert Claiborne and 3 deputies positioned themselves with the casual alertness of people expecting trouble they were prepared to handle with overwhelming force. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone accustomed to speaking to audiences who had no choice but to listen. "Tonight marks a historic moment for Cedar Falls, the beginning of a development project that will bring prosperity and recognition to our community for generations to come," Phantom observed from his position near the back doors, noting the exits Elena had marked on her plans and cataloguing the positions of potential threats. The room was packed beyond its normal capacity, with townspeople who had been drawn by promises of economic opportunity mixed with others who had come because Elena's network had quietly spread word that important revelations would be made. "The Claiborne family has always been committed to the welfare of this community," the mayor continued, launching into a speech that painted his ancestors as benevolent pioneers rather than the systematic murderers Elena's evidence would expose. "Our new resort development will create hundreds of jobs while preserving the natural beauty that makes our mountain valley so special." Eleanor waited in the wings of the community center stage, her simple blue dress replaced by clothing that spoke of preparation for confrontation rather than concealment. She carried with her a leather satchel containing copies of the most damning evidence, documents that would transform the evening from a civic presentation into an indictment of crimes spanning more than a century. The moment came when Mayor Claiborne opened the floor for questions, expecting the usual softball inquiries about construction timelines and employment opportunities. Instead, Elena emerged from the side entrance with the confident stride of someone who had been waiting over a century for this exact moment. "I have a question about the land ownership for your proposed development," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room despite its quiet intensity. "Specifically, I'd like to know how the Claiborne family acquired title to property that legally belongs to the Morrison family." The change in Mayor Claiborne's expression was immediate and revealing. Surprise, shifting quickly to recognition and then to the kind of cold calculation that Phantom had seen in the faces of enemy commanders who suddenly understood they were facing a dangerous opponent than they had anticipated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you're referring to," the mayor replied, his political instincts automatically engaging damage control protocols. "All development properties have been thoroughly researched and legally acquired according to state and federal requirements." Elena smiled with the confidence of someone holding irrefutable evidence, including the 3,000 acres originally claimed by Thomas Morrison in 1885, the mineral rights that were legally inherited by his daughter Eleanor Morrison, the property your family has been illegally occupying since they murdered the rightful owners in 1898. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as Elena's accusations hit the assembled crowd like physical blows. Sheriff Claiborne moved immediately toward the stage, his hand resting on his weapon, while his deputies spread out to control the exits. But Elena had anticipated their response, and her allies throughout the audience were already prepared to act. Mary Elizabeth Hartwell stood up with a stack of historical documents, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who had spent decades researching local history. "I've been comparing territorial land records with current property deeds," she announced. "The documentation Elena Morrison is referring to exists in the state archives, and it proves the Claiborne family has been fraudulently claiming ownership of stolen property for over a century." Dr. Chen rose from her seat with medical records that painted a different picture of local health statistics. "I've also been reviewing unexplained deaths and disappearances over the past 50 years, she said, her professional credentials lending weight to accusations that would have been dismissed as conspiracy theories from less credible sources. "The pattern suggests systematic crimes that have been covered up by law enforcement. Sheriff." Claiborne's response was swift and predictable. "Orders to his deputies to arrest Elena for disturbing the peace and making false accusations against public officials." But Phantom had positioned himself to intercept such moves, and his military training gave him advantages that small-town law enforcement had never encountered. The first deputy found himself on the floor with his weapon removed. Before he fully understood what had happened, Phantom's movement so swift and efficient that most of the audience missed the action entirely. The second deputy hesitated long enough for several townspeople to position themselves between him and Elena, creating a human barrier that would require violence against civilians to overcome. "This is an illegal assembly," Sheriff Claiborne shouted, trying to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his ability to manage. "Everyone needs to leave immediately or face arrest for conspiracy and disturbing the peace." But Elena had spent over a century preparing for exactly this moment, and she wasn't about to be silenced by threats that had worked against previous generations of potential witnesses. She reached into her satchel and produced the original deed documents, holding them high enough for the entire audience to see. "These are the legal papers that prove my father's original claim to the land your family stole," she announced, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had endured impossible hardships to reach this moment of truth. "Signed, witnessed, and registered with territorial authorities before William Claiborne ever set foot in this valley." The mayor's attempt to dismiss the documents as forgeries fell flat when Elena produced corroborating evidence from multiple sources, geological surveys that matched her father's claim descriptions, witness testimonies that had been preserved in family letters, and most damaging of all, correspondence between early Claiborne family members discussing their plans to eliminate the Morrison family and claim their property. But the most powerful moment came when Elena reached for the ancient mining bell and struck it 3 times. With a hammer she had brought for exactly this purpose. The sound that echoed through the community center was more than just noise. It was a call to justice that seemed to resonate with something deeper than normal human hearing. "This bell once warned miners of danger," Elena said, her voice somehow carrying perfectly despite the chaos in the room. "Tonight, it warns this community about dangers that have been hidden for over a century. Crimes that have been covered up by the very people you've trusted to protect you." As the bell's echo faded, Elena began reading names from the memorial cross. 43 children whose deaths had been hidden beneath layers of corruption and intimidation. Each name carried with it a story of family destroyed, lives cut short, and justice denied by people who had used their power to escape consequences for unspeakable crimes. The effect on the assembled townspeople was electric. These weren't abstract historical crimes being discussed. These were the grandparents and great-grandparents of people still living in the community, families whose disappearances had been explained by convenient lies that no one had been brave enough to challenge. Sheriff Claiborne made one final attempt to restore order through force, drawing his weapon and ordering Elena to cease her presentation. But Phantom was already moving, his military training allowing him to close the distance and disarm the sheriff before a shot could be fired. The action sent a clear message to everyone present. Elena's accusations were being backed by someone with the skills necessary to protect her from the violent retaliation that had silenced previous witnesses. The first phase of the confrontation had gone exactly as Elena had planned. The truth was now in the open, supported by irrefutable evidence and witnessed by the entire community. But Phantom knew that the Claiborne family's response would escalate quickly beyond what the community center could contain. "Get everyone out," he told Eleanor quietly, recognizing that their enemies would soon be bringing resources to bear that would endanger innocent civilians. This is just the beginning. The original land grant certificate emerged from Elena's satchel like a piece of history that had been waiting over a century to see daylight. Written on parchment that bore the official seal of the Colorado Territory and signed by Governor Samuel Crawford himself, the document represented unassailable proof of Elena's legal claim to property that had formed the foundation of Claiborne wealth for 5 generations. "This is the territorial grant that gave my father legal ownership of mineral rights throughout this valley," Elena announced, holding the certificate high enough for everyone to see despite the chaos that had erupted around them. Signed on August 15, 1885, witnessed by 3 territorial officials, and recorded in the official land registry before William Claiborne had even heard of Cedar Falls. Mayor Claiborne's response was immediate and desperate, a lunge toward Elena that was intended to destroy the evidence before anyone could examine it closely. But Phantom intercepted the attack with the same precision he'd used to disarm the sheriff, sending the mayor sprawling across the stage while securing the precious document that represented Elena's legal vindication. The confrontation had moved beyond simple revelation into active combat, with the Claiborne family and their allies making increasingly desperate attempts to prevent evidence from reaching outside authorities. Sheriff Claiborne had radioed for backup from county and state law enforcement, claiming that domestic terrorists were threatening public safety and needed to be suppressed with overwhelming force. But Elena's century of preparation had anticipated exactly this response. Even as local authorities mobilized to protect their criminal allies, her network of contacts was simultaneously delivering copies of the evidence to state investigators, federal authorities, and media outlets that would ensure the story could never be completely suppressed. Dr. Chen had photographed every document with her phone, uploading images to cloud storage that could be accessed by journalists and law enforcement agencies beyond Claiborne influence. Mary Elizabeth Hartwell was live-streaming the confrontation on social media platforms that would preserve video evidence, even if local authorities attempted to confiscate recording devices. "You can't stop this," Eleanor told Mayor Claiborne as he struggled to his feet, his polished political facade finally stripped away to reveal the desperate criminal beneath. "Too many people know the truth now, and too many copies of the evidence exist in too many places for you to destroy them all." The mayor's response revealed the depth of his family's corruption and their willingness to use extreme measures to protect their stolen empire. "You think you've won something here?" he snarled, abandoning any pretense of respectability. "You think exposing old crimes matters when we control every institution that could prosecute them? We own this county, and we'll own the state investigators who try to challenge us." But Elena's smile carried confidence, built on more than just evidence and legal documentation. "You're thinking like criminals who have always been able to buy their way out of trouble," she said. "But some crimes are so terrible they create their own momentum for justice. And some truths are so powerful they can't be stopped by money or political influence." As if summoned by her words, the community center doors opened to admit federal agents who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Elena's network had included contacts within agencies that specialized in investigating historical crimes and contemporary corruption, and they had been building their own case based on evidence she had been providing for months. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," announced the lead agent, displaying credentials that immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. "Mayor Claiborne, Sheriff Claiborne, you're both under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal civil rights statutes related to the systematic cover-up of historical crimes. The federal intervention represented the culmination of Elena's century-long investigation, but it also triggered the final desperate response from people who had spent their entire lives believing they were beyond the reach of justice. Sheriff Claiborne made a last attempt to destroy the original land grant certificate, drawing a backup weapon and firing shots that sent the assembled townspeople diving for cover. Phantom's military training took over completely, his body moving with lethal efficiency to neutralize threats, while protecting civilians who had become inadvertent participants in a conflict that reached back through generations of violence and corruption. The skills that had kept him alive in Vietnam jungles proved equally effective in protecting innocents from enemies who had inherited their predecessors' willingness to murder anyone who threatened their power. When the gunfire ended, Sheriff Claiborne lay unconscious on the community center floor, his weapon secured and his capacity for violence permanently neutralized. Mayor Claiborne sat in federal custody, his political career destroyed and his family's century of criminal dominance finally ended by evidence that could no longer be suppressed or discredited. Elena stood at the center of the transformed community center, holding the land grant certificate that proved her rightful ownership of property stolen by murder and maintained through fraud. But more important than legal vindication was the knowledge that 43 murdered children would finally receive the justice that had been denied for over a century. "It's finished," she said quietly, though Phantom could see in her expression both satisfaction and the exhaustion that comes when a burden carried too long is finally set down. Timothy and all the others can finally rest in peace, knowing that their deaths have been acknowledged and their killers held accountable. The federal agents who took custody of Elena's evidence treated it with the respect due to documentation that would rewrite local history and expose corruption that had infected multiple levels of government. The original land grant certificate would become the centerpiece of legal proceedings that would strip the Claiborne family of illegally acquired wealth and transfer ownership to its rightful heir. But perhaps most significant was the transformation in the townspeople who had witnessed Elena's revelation. No longer passive victims of institutional corruption, they had become active participants in demanding justice for crimes that had shaped their community's development. The fear and silence that had protected the Claiborne dynasty for generations had been broken by truth that could no longer be contained as the community center gradually emptied and federal agents completed their initial evidence collection. Elena approached Phantom with gratitude that transcended simple thanks for protection during a dangerous confrontation. "You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever," she said, her ancient eyes finally showing peace rather than the desperate determination that had sustained her through impossible years. "You gave me someone who believed my story, someone willing to help me complete a mission that had to be finished before I could finally let go." Phantom understood that Elena's long vigil was ending, that justice served would finally allow her to find the rest that had been denied since the winter of 1898. But he also realized that her departure would leave him with responsibilities that would reshape his own life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The land grant certificate had made Elena the legal owner of property worth millions. But more important was her plan to use that wealth in service of justice for other victims whose crimes had never been exposed. The Claiborne family's defeat was not an ending, but a beginning of efforts to heal damage that reached far beyond a single mountain community. Tomorrow, Elena would begin the process of transferring her inheritance to purposes that would honor the memory of 43 murdered children while ensuring that similar crimes could never again be hidden by wealth and political influence. And Phantom would begin a new chapter of his own life, one dedicated to protecting others rather than simply protecting himself from the pain of human connection. The new cabin foundation stones lay precisely arranged, in a meadow that had once been part of the original Morrison family homestead, each piece carefully selected and positioned according to plans that honored both the past and the promise of a different future. Phantom ran his weathered hands along the smooth granite blocks, feeling the weight of purpose that had replaced the aimless solitude of his previous mountain existence. 3 months had passed since the federal investigation concluded with convictions that had dismantled the Claiborne criminal empire and restored Elena's rightful ownership of property stolen through generations of violence and fraud. The trials had made national news, exposing corruption that reached far beyond Cedar Falls and inspiring similar investigations into historical crimes across the American West. Elena emerged from the tree line carrying wildflowers she'd gathered from the memorial sites they now maintained together, her movements showing a peace that had been absent during the desperate years of her solitary vigil. The legal victory had transformed her from a guardian spirit haunted by unfinished justice into someone who could finally begin building something positive from the ashes of terrible loss. The contractors say they can break ground next week, she said, arranging the flowers in a simple vase that would grace their future kitchen table. The children's center will be ready for occupancy by next spring, and the memorial park should be completed before the first anniversary of the trials. Phantom nodded, studying architectural plans that showed how Eleanor intended to use her reclaimed inheritance. Rather than simply enjoying the wealth that was rightfully hers, she had dedicated most of it to creating institutions that would protect other children from the kind of violence that had destroyed her family over a century ago. The Elena Morrison Foundation for Missing Children would provide resources for searching remote wilderness areas, support for families dealing with unexplained disappearances, and funding for investigations into cases that local authorities were unwilling or unable to pursue. The memorial park would ensure that Timothy and the 43 other murdered children were never forgotten again, their names carved in stone that would weather centuries, while their stories served as reminders of the price of unchallenged corruption. But more important was the living memorial represented by the Children's Center, a place where contemporary families could find safety, education, and hope in the same valley where previous generations had found only terror and loss. Dr. Chen wants to know if you've decided about her offer, Elena continued, referring to the proposal that Phantom serve as the Foundation's security director and wilderness safety coordinator. She thinks your mountain experience and protective instincts would be valuable assets for the search and rescue operations. Phantom had been wrestling with the decision for weeks, uncertain whether he was ready to fully abandon the isolation that had defined his adult life for 3 decades. The prospect of regular human contact, of responsibilities that extended beyond his own survival, represented a fundamental change that both attracted and terrified him. But Elena's example had shown him that some purposes were large enough to justify the risk of opening oneself to new possibilities for both connection and loss. I've been thinking about what you said about second chances, he admitted, setting down the foundation stone he'd been examining, about how sometimes they come wrapped in ways we don't expect, from directions we never saw coming. Eleanor's smile carried understanding, built on her own experience of transformation, from victim to guardian, to someone capable of building hope from the ruins of tragedy. Timothy would have been your Sarah's age if he'd lived, she said gently. Sometimes healing our own wounds means preventing similar wounds from being inflicted on others. The comparison hit Phantom with the force of recognition rather than pain. For 30 years, he'd carried Sarah's memory like a burden that could never be set down, grief that defined him more completely than any of his positive experiences or accomplishments. But Elena's example suggested the possibility of transforming that grief into energy for protecting other children, of finding purpose in ensuring that other fathers never had to experience the loss that had driven him into mountain solitude. Mary Elizabeth has been asking about the historical documentation project. Elena continued, referring to the comprehensive effort to preserve evidence of the crimes that had been exposed through their investigation. She thinks the Foundation should sponsor a complete archive of territorial-era violence against mining families, something that could help other communities uncover similar cover-ups. The scope of Elena's vision extended far beyond personal vindication or even local justice. She understood that the Claiborne family's crimes represented a pattern that had been repeated throughout the West during the mining boom years. Systematic violence that had been hidden by the same combination of wealth, political influence, and deliberate historical amnesia that had protected her family's killers for over a century. Phantom picked up one of the foundation stones, feeling its weight and solidity as he considered the magnitude of what they were planning to build together. The cabin would be their home, but it would also serve as headquarters for operations that could help other families find answers to questions that conventional law enforcement had been unable or unwilling to address. I keep thinking about what you told me that first night. In your impossible cabin, he said, remembering Elena's words about time moving differently in the mountains, about how some things appear when they're needed, how people find what they're meant to find when the moment is right. Elena nodded, understanding the direction of his thoughts. We found each other because we were both carrying burdens that were too heavy for one person to bear alone. You needed someone who understood what it meant to lose everything that gave life meaning. I needed someone who understood that some fights are worth risking everything to win. As evening approached, they worked together to level the ground where their cabin's foundation would rest, each stone representing not just structural support, but symbolic commitment to building something lasting from the materials of shattered lives. The physical labor felt like meditation, purposeful movement that connected them to the earth where so much tragedy had occurred and where healing was finally beginning to take root. The town of Cedar Falls spread out below them in the valley, its lights beginning to twinkle as families settled into evening routines that no longer carried the hidden fear of unacknowledged corruption. The federal investigations had brought new leadership, honest law enforcement, and the kind of civic transparency that allowed communities to address problems rather than simply enduring them. Sometimes I wonder what Timothy would think of all this, Elena said, placing the final stone of the evening and stepping back to survey their progress. Whether he'd approve of using his memory to help other children, whether he'd understand why it took so long to find justice for what happened to him. Phantom thought about his own conversations with Sarah's memory, the decades of one-sided dialogue that had helped him process grief while maintaining connection to love that death had interrupted but not destroyed. Children want the people who love them to be happy, he said finally. They want their deaths to mean something beyond just loss, to contribute to a world where other children are safer because of lessons learned from their suffering. As stars emerged in the darkening sky above their mountain meadow, Elena and Phantom sat beside the foundation stones that would support their shared future. Two people who had found in each other the possibility of transforming grief into purpose, isolation into connection, and the weight of terrible memories into energy for building something better. The second chance that life had offered them came not as replacement for what they'd lost, but as opportunity to honor that loss through service to others who needed protection, justice, and hope. Tomorrow, they would continue building, both literally and figuratively, creating from the stones of tragedy a foundation strong enough to support dreams that neither could have imagined during their darkest years of solitude. In the distance, the lights of Cedar Falls reflected a community finally free from the shadows of hidden crimes, while above them, the same stars that had witnessed a century of injustice now illuminated the beginning of healing that would reach far beyond the boundaries of one mountain valley. The foundation they were building together would support not just their own renewed faith in the possibility of justice, but structures that would help other families find answers, safety, and hope in a world that often seemed designed to deny all three.